How we doing, guys, gals, friends from all over the world? Welcome to the channel. My name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Today we're going to talk about how to build an Atlantic Records collection. And Atlantic's one of the most important labels. They kind of slip under the radar a little bit to jazz collectors, and it really shouldn't. A lot of very important jazz records came out on Atlantic. Founded by Neshui and Ahmet Ertegun, a couple of Turkish immigrants. They had a vision. They saw the potential of black music in America and the untapped market, and they turned their small little black-driven R&B jazz label into one of the biggest labels in the world by the 80s and the 90s, and they were filled with metal bands and rock and roll classics and Led Zeppelin. They had a lot of the big acts. So Atlantic really became a preeminent label and one of the majors in the world. But the roots of Atlantic were in jazz and R&B and the blues, and they definitely deserve more credit than they get. They were very consistent with the black message that they put out. A lot of very young black female and male talent to record. They run concurrently 2 series. There's an 8,000 series, which is more pop, R&B, vocal, the blues, and then a 1200 series, which is more predominantly driven by jazz. And there is crossover. Ray Charles has records on both series. Big Joe Turner has records on both series. So it's not cleanly defined, but the 8,000 series is definitely more leaning towards pop, towards the average white audience. The 1200 series is definitely meant more for serious musicians, serious music fans, jazz fans. So that being said, let's dive in. I want to have a couple precursors here real quickly. A few things from the 8000 series, and a couple are 1200 too, but Ray Charles makes a string of very important recordings at Atlantic, and his brother Ray, and his records in the 12 and 1300 series are outstanding, and they complement his stuff on the 8000 series, which is more pop and more vocally driven. But Ray's a great player. He is a bit like Stevie Wonder, where he can play a lot of different instruments. Super talented. This is, of course, on the 8000 series, 8029. What I'd say was a massive breakthrough, one of the great songs of all time. Big Joe Turner, 1332. The Boss of the Blues, 1234. That's a pretty early one. Old Atlantic 1200 stuff's getting tougher to come by. You see old Atlantic 1200 stuff. There's Laverne Baker, 1281, another great blues singer. Ruth Brown, she has records on both sequences. And then this is Lurleen Hunter, who also has stuff on both sequences. This is 1344. And so that gives you an idea of some of the basics of what Atlantic is doing. Rhythm and blues, very black driven, very much a lot of integrity. And I don't feel like they have the same kind of militancy of the Blue Note stable. It's much more diversified. It's not just one thing. Blue Note in 1958 was one thing. It was a bunch of hard bop cats and a few stragglers from the bebop era putting out a high velocity, intense hard bop. Atlantic has a much wider scope. So there's not this unified vision of what Atlantic's doing. But by that same token, in 56, 57, they're ahead of the curve in terms of allowing a wide, broad swath of things that are going to become the avant-garde that don't even exist yet. Atlantic's saying, yeah, we can let you do that. Go ahead, try that. Try that out, Ornette Coleman. Try that out, Charlie Mingus. Try that out, John Coltrane. And those are 3 of the great names of innovative change in jazz in the late 50s. Few people make more changes in the music than Mingus, Coltrane, and Ornette Coleman. So Atlantic deserves a lot of credit. They embraced the changes in the scene. They recorded and documented it all, and they certainly put out a prolific body of work. I have around 300 Atlantic of the 1200 series, and probably a couple hundred of the 8000 series as well, which is more in the R&B room with your Aretha Franklins and your Will Wilson Pickett's and your Sam and Daves and all that great soul music that Atlantic put out, which is also a legacy in and of itself. But we're going to focus on the jazz, because this is the Jazz Shepherd and the Jazz Channel. So, diving right in. Jack Montrose, fantastic player, West Coast scene, part of that whole Kenton, Woody Herman group. He's a great player. Bob Gordon's also a fantastic baritone player. This is a tough record to come by, number 1, 2, 2, 3. And I found this probably 6 months ago. I've really enjoyed it the 2 times I've listened to it. Some great song selections. And the Red Mitchell's on the bass, Shelly Mann's on the drum. So you're getting a fairly West Coast sounding Atlantic. And of course they're also doing some Shorty Rogers and a few other things of that ilk at this point. People forget just how dominating the West Coast sound was in 53, 54, 55. Like, the stars of jazz were right there. The velocity of the media, the impressions, the charts, the polls, it was all centered around those great West Coast orchestras, as those people were making their own records on all these myriad labels, which is an episode I have coming up soon. All the little micro labels on the West Coast that recorded that West Coast scene. I'm going to show you most of that stuff. I'm still waiting for a few things to come in the mail that I felt needed to be part of that presentation, but it's coming. Number 1224, the very next record, is Lonnie Tristano. Tristano was a very interesting player, an early innovator in some of the sounds of the avant-garde and dissonance. He did some overdubbing that allowed him to make some very interesting time signatures and just interesting arrangement from the perspective of a studio. A modern arranger would understand the way Tristano, but these guys had to splice tape and lay stuff together. Tristano was an interesting person and did some teaching and is an instrumental part of a lot of the jazz kingdom, and a lot of greats credit Tristano and his innovations along with George Russell for bringing some of the changes that happened in the 50s. Number 1237, few records make a bigger impact and change the sound of what jazz potentially can be than Charlie Mingus's Pithecanthropus erectus in 1956. This 1237, and it's followed by 2 or 3 other great records on Atlantic, Blues and Roots, The Clown. There's a number of them. They're fantastic records. His Atlantic stuff, some of my favorite of his work. It's rooted in the blues. It has the edges of the avant-garde, but it usually resolves itself back into the tonic and gives you some satisfaction. That sense of, thank you. The resolve is so important for arrangement and composition. This record really sonically is in a landscape of its own. And as important as a lot of what's to come is, this record's really a door opener, and it's really impressive when you see what else is around this record at Atlantic, just how forward-thinking Pithecanthropus was, and to some degree how risky it was. You're making a pretty angry black man's music, and Mingus was all of that. 1265, the Modern Jazz Quartet, they make an infinite string of records at Atlantic, along with John Lewis making a lot of records himself as a leader, a great piano player. He's trying to meld classical and jazz into one new thing. Some call it third stream. It's melancholic, it's atmospheric, it's pastoral. It loses some of its blues and jazziness because of the composition levels on it. This one's early, probably their first Atlantic after they came over from Savoy, and there's actually still quite a bit of groove on this one. And a lot of their stuff grooves a lot. You got Milt Jackson in the groove. You got the Heath brothers, Connie Kay. The band's pretty incredible. Kenny Clark played drums initially, but it becomes more and more John Lewis's project as the project goes forward. And Milt, at the same time, is putting all these records on his own as a leader. And you see how bluesy and groovy Milt Jackson is, in spite of his work with the Modern Jazz Quartet. Number 1278, the great Art Blakey. This was Art Blakey and Monk together. Monk's filling the piano chair here for this live session. and it ends up on Atlantic. And it's kind of a mystery to me exactly how and why that is, because neither of them were really Atlantic recording artists at this point in 1957. But it's a great find, great little cover, and it's a great record. No question about it. Speaking of Milt Jackson and Ray Charles, here they are together, number 1279, the Soul Brothers. And let me tell you, this is what the black music of that day sounds like. It's hip pocket swiveling stuff. It'll put some boogie in your socks. You know what I mean? You'll be able to do your twist and shouting all the way home. It's just joyous, celebratory, but again, it's so sexy and sensual, and it's always got that duality where there might be something else on the surface that we're thinking of, but we're never not thinking about the Jelly Roll. We're never not thinking about some Juice Pocket. That's just how it is. That's my sense of heaven. My slice of the pie, I'm not getting the mansion on the hill, but I'm going to give me some Juice Pocket tonight. Where's my straw? Give me that juice box. Warren Marsh, a fantastic sax player who kind of is one of those guys, a bit like a Jimmy Joffrey, who is a pretty brilliant player, but kind of exists under the radar somewhat. Again, it's not Wayne, it's Warren with an R, Marsh. His records and who he works with are always really interesting stuff. And he's a great player, and his records fetch really good money nowadays. If you stumble across any of Warren Marsh's records, I recommend you grab them. They're definitely some very interesting, complex, modern things. This is Fathead, which is the great David Newman, another Texas tenor, playing here with Ray Charles, who introduces him, as it were. When you have a label star like a Ray Charles, he's a great way to introduce other talent. To tag them together, like the Milt Jackson, tag them together with Fat Newman, and you hear this new artist, but Ray Charles on, so people buy it. Next thing you know, that artist has their own momentum going. David Newman's a fantastic, bluesy, gutsy Texas player. Just plays a lot of soul-driven, and Atlantic Records actually becomes a very preeminent force in the sound of soul jazz as we move into the 60s. Guys like Hank Crawford, David Newman, Eddie Harris, all those guys are making some fantastic soul jazz records. Keeping it moving along here, this is Blues and Roots, another Charles Mingus record, which I felt obligated to throw in. It's fantastic, and it shows you the gospel, the blues, the edges of a very agitated black male. And that's Mingus to a T. He's agitated. He's not thrilled. He's not happy with the condition of how things are. And so it's great to see Mingus's work at Atlantic and the impact it was having. Charlie Rouse, fantastic horn player, along with the great Julius Watkins, who plays the French horn. These two make 4 records together, maybe 5. And most of it's at Dawn, a great little East Coast label that was a subsidiary of Seco. And Dawn wasn't around very long, but those records at Dawn that they make are great. And then they go to Atlantic and they make 2 records as Les Mode, Les Mode, and they're both fantastic records as well. Anytime you get Julius Watkins on the French horn, it's worth a listen. And of course, not long after this, Charlie Rouse gets drafted by Monk, and he becomes Monk's sidekick for a long time. And Rouse is really one of those kind of underappreciated legends. Chris Connor sings the ballads of the Sad Cafe. She's a big part of the Bethlehem story. She makes a lot of early work at Bethlehem during the 10-inch era, and Bethlehem can't afford to pay her and keep her, and so the Erdogan brothers sign her up, and she makes a string of records at Atlantic, both in the 12-1300 series and in the 8000 series, and it's fantastic, bluesy, soulful. She was initially with Kenton, if I recall, one of those great singers that went through his orchestra, and a lot of them went on to some kind of fame of their own. And now number 1311, John Coltrane's Giant Steps. This is another one of those records where Atlantic deserves recognition here. Everyone's always recognizing Coltrane's developments here and how important Giant Steps was to the process of the movement of the music. Atlantic allows it to happen. Just like Pithecanthropus erectus, the Atlantic label is a part of this development and the rapid changes that were happening. Atlantic's documenting it as much as any label. That's not a mistake. There is no Impulse Records yet. Prestige is far from being a label of development. They're doing jamming swing sessions. They're doing a lot of blues blowing sessions, some modernity, post bebop, but Prestige isn't doing innovative things. The New Jazz label is just starting to become launched. Blue Note's doing very much a one. Blue Note's very much just a one-trick pony. They're doing hard bop and doing it really fucking well. But Blue Note's not pushing the envelope at all in 57, 58 in terms of discovering new territory. This was the territory Blue Note existed in. The West Coast has some developments going on with guys like Jimmy Joffrey and Jerry Mulligan. These guys are writing some more complex arrangements. And George Russell, of course, is starting to do that as well. So there's already an underswell of change happening. But Atlantic Records documents these changes more than anyone else in a way. Riverside's not really broadcasting all these changes. The West Coast labels aren't really. Argo and Emerson are not. They're staying with the blues and the soul and the R&B and Clifford Brown and hard bop. So it's really crazy how little credit Atlantic Records gets. And this record, for all its innovations, is still very accessible, still very listenable. And to me, that's the key of innovation. How useful is it? You can innovate something, but if you put a wheel on top of a car, it doesn't do anybody any good. Your innovation sucked. Innovation's only as good as it is useful, or as good as it is to listen to. And that's the key. That's the magic line. Another fantastic record. This is Milt Jackson with the great Coleman Hawkins, number 1316. And so, one day they're doing Giant Steps. The next day they're documenting the great tenor Giant Coleman Hawkins with the great blues vibraphonist Milt Jackson. Like, that's a pretty wide stretch right there. And not to mention all the stuff that's happening on the R&B imprint, the 8000 series. So Atlantic Studios had to be a pretty busy place, almost zoo-like, constantly, with the talent that was coming and going. Ornette Coleman, number 1317. Once again, one of the most iconic records in the jazz canon. Along with the Mingus, along with the Coltrane, here we find the fantastic Ornette Coleman, Shape of Jazz to Come. With his plastic little alto saxophone, inventing this kind of free range of playing. We're going to meet at certain mile markers where we're going to be kind of free in between. Free hadn't become coined a phrase yet, and Ornette kind of actually detested it because this was actually very rehearsed what they were doing. They had to be structured to it in order for the freeness aspect to be in any way effective. Put it this way, it's like saying, okay, we're going to go on this rally road race. There's going to be 4 checkpoints. We all have to be at those checkpoints, but how you get to those checkpoints in between, that's up to you. But the checkpoints have to be arranged. We have to have that set in place so we know as musicians where we're going to be and how we're going to get there. So the freedom is limited and structured, and Ornette actually balked a lot at the title free. He thought it was very misconstrued. Another important record he makes in the same time frame. Just wanted to throw that in there for the comprehension's sake. Number 1330, pardon me. Yeah, 1330. Jimmy Joffrey. He makes a number of great records at Atlantic in the 1200 into the 1300 series. It's actually one of his last ones, but I love the album cover so much. I believe Jim Hall's on this along with Bob Brookmeyer. Brookmeyer's got this wonderful melancholic honey dripping trombone. Like, if you want to hear what honey sounds like in a trombone, Bobby Brookmeyer's your guy. And Jim Hall's a fantastic melodious player on the guitar. So you put that wonderful melodious guitar with that honey dripping trombone with the interesting sharp edges of Jimmy Joffrey. What you have is a syrup with a bug in it. It's fantastic. And of course with some Western themes as well. Really a cool record. All Joffrey stuff on Atlantic is worth seeking out. Philly Joe Jones, fantastic drummer, one of the most hard swinging drummers in the modern era. He really has this loose but fun feel to his playing. He's got a fairly wide range in dynamics. He can really pelt it and drive it, or else he can also swing hard really softly. One of the best soft swingers in my mind is Philly Joe Jones. You hear him playing on a ballad, and he's still swinging so hard, so softly. It's really beautiful. He gets 2 records as a leader, plus a split title with Alvin Jones with the 2 drummers. And he drafts some great players. There are Bill Barron's on this, Michael Downs, Walter Davis, Paul Chambers. These records are getting tougher to find, believe it or not. The prices are going up on these, 60, 80, 100 bucks now for some of these old Atlantics. These Atlantic records sold fairly well, and their distribution becomes immense. In the early mid-50s, Atlantic's a very small regional thing. But because it stays an entity for so long, it doesn't sell, it stays Atlantic. As the stars of these jazz players rose in other labels and other eras and other times, Atlantic still own Coltrane's Atlantic work. So they could keep putting it in print. They still own Ornette's work. They still own Mingus's work. So they could constantly be putting these albums back and reissuing them, repressing them. And so that means that most of the Atlantic great titles have been issued a lot in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Most Atlantic titles aren't too hard to find. The toughest ones are the in-between crack 1200 series stuff. There's some stuff in the 1200 series that's really small, unheard of. Some great singers. I love the Patty McGovern record. Fantastic. Thomas Talbert makes a couple great records. Some really cool stuff on the 1200 series that no one knows of today or remembers. Some of those are pretty hard to find and probably haven't been reissued very often. But most of the Atlantic stuff has been issued a lot. A record like Giant Steps, you'll find in My Favorite Things, Coltrane, you're going to find those records have been issued 20 times, which means they're available. You can find them. This is Our Music, another Ornette Coleman record that's fairly important, number 1353. I just wanted to show you that, just to give you some of the spectrum of what an Atlantic session might look like from one day to the next. Slide Hampton, not Hampton Hawes. Slide Hampton is a fantastic trombone player. One of the guys that's kind of forgotten nowadays for some reason. He makes 4 records at Atlantic that are just gospel-driven, blues-driven, swing, a bit in the Benny Green style, where he's a very melodic player. He wants to have a pocket, and he really is a fun player to listen to. I love his records on Atlantic. And again, they're climbing up in value nowadays. Those records you used to see for 8, 10, 12, 15 bucks. Some of them are now going for 40, 50, 60 bucks. And the original pressings are now starting to push 100 or more. This is Hank Crawford, number 1405. And if you're a fan of Stanley Turrentine, if you're a fan of Ike Quebec, if you like R&B, blues, crossover, Hank Crawford's your guy. And he's very much in that vein of the R&B, jazz, storytelling, crossover. And he's going to make records that you can put 45s in the jukeboxes. And all of Crawford's records from the early 60s through into the early 70s are great records that you will always enjoy listening to. You can play at a barbecue, and people are going to be like, thanks for playing that. Whatever that was cool. Art Farmer makes 2 or 3 records at Atlantic that are outstanding. This one with Jim Hall, Interaction, it's probably my favorite. Cool cover. Just beautiful, cerebral melancholy. You know, it's fantastic stuff. I'm going to turn this blues off for now. We'll play a little Jim Hall and Art Farmer. And those of you who listen to my channel before know Art Farmer's a great player in a Miles Davis ilk. Very beautiful, soft, almost a cloudy, fuzzy tone at times. He can play hard and bright, but he's really, to me, best when he's lyrically singing a ballad and rocking you to sleep. Him and Jim Hall make a fantastic concoction together. This is Stitt Plays Bird. Sonny Stitt makes 2 or 3 records at Atlantic. Stitt's such a giant, the lone wolf as he was known. His recording career is long. I have probably 60 Sonny Stitt records, and that's not including everything he does after 1970 or so. There's another probably 20 records there at least. His records at Roost are outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. His records at Verve are outstanding. And these records he makes at Atlantic are also really high quality. He's a great emoter. You get the feeling that Sonny Stitt could probably play and record a record in his sleep. He's just such a always playing, always driving, always moving, He never settled down with one even group. He was always kind of just out there being the lone wolf. And it means he always has a saxophone probably next to him on his bedside. Number 1457, Dave Pike, Jazz for the Jet Set, with a little space age helmet. This record is very tough to find. It's very expensive. It goes for $100, $200 at auctions on a regular basis. It took me a long time to track this one down. I'm a little shocked at why this one goes for what it does. Because I got it, I remember listening to it, and I'm like, okay, this is a fun record, but why exactly is it that collectible? Is it just the album cover alone? I'm not sure. But I thought there was going to be something magical about it, something very unique, and I didn't find that to be the case myself. Nat Adderley, Cannonball's brother, is one of the most fiery cornet trumpet players that gets forgotten a lot. He's in the Freddie Hubbard, Clifford Brown, Booker Little circle of just guys that spit fire into their trumpet. You know, more so than Lee Morgan, more so than Donald Byrd. He's a very aggressive, very tactile player that's spitting just thunder into his horn, and is fairly relentless in his approach, almost frazzled at times. Joe Zawinul shows up on the piano on this one, Victor Gaskins on the bass, Roy McCurdy on the drums, and I've note Joe Henderson plays the saxophone tenor on this, and I'm a big Joe Henderson guy, and if you're a jazz fan, you should be a Joe Henderson fan. He's absolutely a fantastic player, and I want to listen to that later today. Speaking of Freddie Hubbard, he comes over to Atlantic after having a great run of records at Blue Note. He goes to Impulse, makes a couple quick records, and then he ends up back at Blue Note briefly, and then he ends up at Atlantic probably 1966. He makes 5 or 6 records, and it's definitely the era where Atlantic's moving more towards soul, jazz, that crossover. And Hubbard knows the deal. Blue Note was doing the same thing with the Boogaloo and trying to make jukebox songs. Yet Freddie Hubbard was never really interested in being a jukebox hero. He wasn't ever going to be Tommy, Can You Hear Me? He's going to be the Wild Kids. And he was always a fiery player. I love his Atlantic work. This has James Spaulding on it, Bob Cunningham, Otis Ray Appleton, Ray Barretto's on the percussion. Fantastic stuff. And you can find Freddie Hubbard's Atlantic work for $5, $10, $15, while his Blue Note goes for $150. So Atlantic does have that advantage because of how big Atlantic got. These records got distributed well, and it keeps their costs down for collectors. This is a great Elvin Jones record, of course, who played with Coltrane for years in his quartet. This is right around the time he's leaving the quartet, 65 probably. This record's also very tough to come by. This one I can tell you why, because Hank Mobley's on it. And Coltrane had gone so far off by 65. I think Elvin wanted to play with something that was more centered, more melodic, more gospel and blues, and Hank Mobley was the obvious choice. This is a great record, Midnight Walk. One of those records you got to search out, and it goes for more than his other records on Atlantic does. And it took me a while to figure it out until I saw, oh, Hank Mobley, that's why. And you'll probably have to pay $60, $70 for that in good shape at least. Number 1488 is Roy Ayers. Roy Ayers was a great modern vibraphonist, and he comes into the scene in the late 60s, played fairly straight trad jazz still at this point. But by the 70s, he's making some of the great R&B fusion jazz records of the day. Don't Stop the Feeling. Those are fun songs that if you have a room full of old black folk, they will dance to that stuff. They love Roy Ayers' work. My life, my life, my life, my life in the sunshine. Everybody, those songs, they have a place in the black community. But that's a little earlier, but it still shows you Roy Ayers' journey to becoming that R&B fusion jazz crossover king that he became. Eddie Harris, who makes a lot of records at VJ, ends up at Atlantic, and he actually starts plugging a saxophone in and making this electric saxophone sound and really messing with some interesting tonics and tones. But he's really a great R&B blues player that plays with a lot of soul. And so you see again just the blackness of Atlantic. There's a lot of great levels to what Atlantic's doing here. Max Roach ends up at Atlantic here in about 1968, 69, somewhere in that era. And Roach's career is very sporadic in terms of the labels he's recording on. He has some consistency with Clifford Brown and Emersy, 53, 54, 55. But then Max moves around a lot. He's in a lot of different places. Impulse, Argo, Riverside. He's just kind of popping around, Candid. But he kind of gets a second home in Atlantic. He makes a string of really solid records there. Members don't get weary. He kind of is selling into some of his black roots and experimenting with a lot of different sounds. And there's never a Max Roach record that you shouldn't own. If you find a Max Roach record in the wild, just grab it. He's an interesting cat. He's always trying to tell us something. This is a bit of an honorable mention here. This is Jackie Paris, who's one of my favorite singers. Kind of an East Coast lounge singer, a bit like Joe DeRise. Something soft like Mel Torme, but not as velvety as The Fog. But he's in that kind of softer, gentle. He's not the boisterous of a Tony Bennett or a Frank Sinatra where it's full throttle. He's more melancholic and softer with his approach and kind of drips honey and syrup on those words and puts them in such a beautiful way that the gals are enticed. Jackie's a ladies' guy. His record at Impulse is tough to find and outstanding. This record's equally tough to find and has less legacy. It's on the East-West imprint, which only makes 4 records, I think, as a jazz sequence, and then they just disappear that line. But this 4002, it's a great record, wonderful jazz backing. And as I've said before, as important to a jazz record vocally is the jazz singer just singing melody, altering melody, and are they reshaping rhythm? Are they singing ahead and behind? But as much as those things are impacting a jazz singer, the band that they're singing with has as much to say about is this record a jazz record or is this a pop record? You know, you could put the best bebop scatter singer in the world, you put it behind some really poppy arrangements, it's going to stay poppy. So that's a really important thing to remember, is a jazz singer is as good as the band and the production behind them. And you can put any singer behind a great trio, and they're going to have a certain amount of soul and jazz to that trio that's going to make their words seem jazzier than behind some big arranged choral with all kinds of strings and lush arrangements and complex. That stuff loses its jazz sensibility at times, you know, and it's such a fine line. Because some of it can have big swing arrangements, which can swing really hard. But some of it gets too Hollywood studio, we're going to put at the end of the film, have a big happy ending kind of sounding shit. So it's a tough balance to find jazz vocals that you love. So bottom line, collect Atlantic records, enjoy the affordability of Atlantic records, recognize how many great innovative records are on Atlantic, enjoy the 8000 sequence as well for all of its fantastic black rhythm and blues. It's not watered down. The Erdogan brothers seem to have actually compared to a lot of what's going on in the music industry. And again, there's such levels to that. Herman Lubinsky at Savoy and the Phil and Leonard Chess in Chicago, those guys were bad to their black musicians. Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf of Blue Note were great to their musicians. And there's kind of a tier that exists in between. But from what I've heard about the Erdogan brothers, they seem to have respected their black musicians and treated them fairly well. And again, that's not written in stone. I'm sure there's going to be someone out there who might know more on that. But I've always gotten the feeling that the people who worked with the Erdigans appreciated what they did and appreciated the opportunity that's were given to them. And even the black guys who recorded for Savoy, they might not have liked Herman Lubinsky, and they probably wouldn't have thrown him a life preserver if he was drowning, but they still appreciated the opportunity they got to record in Newark and get that music out there. So that wraps up today's episode on Atlantic. It's a super important record label. Anything 1200, 1300, 1400 series, grab it. As you get to 1600 series, it starts to become a little bit more pop and polished. You know, I mean, the times have changed by 1600. You're into the late 60s, early 70s by then. And then they changed the numbers up completely in the 70s, so those numbers no longer have any relevance. But if you're looking for vintage stuff from the 50s, 60s, into the early 70s, the Atlantic 1200 to 1600 series is a great series of records. I own pretty much all the 1200, most of the 1300, except for a few compilation things and a few weird titles. And they do throw some weird stuff in there at times. And then as we get later, the 14 and 1500s, I have probably 70 14s and maybe 50 of the half of the 1500 series. So almost 300 Atlantic in that series. It's great stuff, and you will always enjoy it. And only the really rare out of print ones from the early days really fetch big money. Y'all be safe. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you want to support the channel on Patreon, throw down $5 a month. It's always appreciated. You can go to the store and the merchandise in the description, and there's all kinds of great t-shirts and hoodies. It's always appreciated as well. Y'all stay safe out there. We'll talk to y'all soon. Atlantic, peace.